Friends, welcome to Zealots at the Gate, a Comment original podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Send us an email with feedback, questions at zealots@comment.org, and make sure you tag us on social media. I'm Matthew Kamick.
And I'm Shadi Hamid. Matt and I are good friends, but maybe you wouldn't expect that. Matt's Christian, I'm Muslim. Matt's conservative, I'm sort of liberal. Matt's white, I'm brown. Also, Matt's a theologian, I'm a political scientist.
Together we research religion, politics, and the future of democracy at Georgetown University. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Today we have a special and somewhat unusual episode where it's just going to be me and Matt going back and forth. I've just read a very interesting and important and influential book in modern Christianity. It's one that a lot of Christians read, as I understand it. It's called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis will be famous to many of you for the Chronicles of Narnia. I think most of us read C.S. Lewis as kids to one degree or another. And only recently did I realize that he was a convert to Christianity who was quite vocal about his Christian beliefs. And he wrote Mere Christianity to kind of it's kind of a primer. It lays out what Christianity is from his viewpoint in a way that is quite compelling. He's a beautiful writer. And it was a chance for me as a Muslim to engage with this book, not knowing exactly what to expect, but feeling very nourished from it afterwards. No, I have not converted. The book did not succeed in doing that, but it did help me understand some key questions and themes regarding Christianity that maybe I hadn't fully understood before. But what we want to do in this episode is basically, for me as an outsider, to talk to Matt as an insider and to push him on some things that came up while I was reading C.S. Lewis's book. But maybe before we get into all of that, Matt, could you tell us a little bit about C.S. Lewis's story, what you know about his conversion, and why is this book important for Christians? I hope I'm not overstating its importance.
Sure. So C.S. Lewis grew up in the early 20th century in England, and he was a brilliant young man, a young scholar of medieval literature, and was really sharp and could not quite bring himself to the Christian faith, was quite critical of it. And through a series of conversations with other faithful and intelligent Christians, also through reading people like George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton and others, actually came to faith. But during World War II, he gave a series of radio talks on the very basics of Christianity. And they were kind of put together in this book that we know of as Mere Christianity. And it was a very influential book, not only in England, but here in the United States for evangelicals. And my early encounter with Lewis, I think I read him when I was, 20 years old. I think I was a junior in college, maybe. And I had always been a Christian, but that book was, it was an important part of me becoming, I suppose, an intellectually engaged Christian. So evangelicals are very much known for loving Jesus with their heart, but not always loving him with their brain. And C.S. Lewis offers a thoughtful, critically wise engagement with the Christian faith, and his literature background and his storytelling background makes him, more delightful and clear to read. So it's an important book for generations of evangelicals as they think about Christianity.
Okay, great. So let's get right to it. For those of you who are watching along, here is what the book looks like. We'll include a link to it in the show notes. And also the back cover is interesting as well because it promises a lot. It says the beloved classic on what all Christians believe. And I'd been thinking about whether there are books about Islam that claim as much as that. It's a big claim. So there's a lot we can talk about. Maybe the place I'd like to start us off on is, well, the title of the book is Mere Christianity. So in that sense, it's trying to say, well, this is what the faith is about at its kind of core essence. And I think for me, I've always felt that Christianity is not particularly easy to understand, especially when it comes to difficult and thorny questions like the Trinity and Jesus as the Father and the Son, and how to think about that kind of internal relationship within the Trinity. Has, as a Muslim, it's going to be challenging for someone like me. We won't really get, I don't think, too much into the Trinity because I don't think that's what's most interesting or exciting about this book. I do want to start with the claim of C.S. Lewis, agreeing with what I just said, that Christianity is not simple. That's how he puts it. It's not simple. It's not the kind of religion that you would come up with if you could. If you were designing a rational, reasonable religion, you wouldn't come up with a story that's as kind of mysterious and challenging as the story of Christ dying for our sins. That's not the most intuitive thing you'd think of.
Yeah, and I think, here, you and I, Shadi, we disagree on all kinds of theological issues and whatnot. But here I think you and I really do agree on this, that Christianity is not what we would invent if we were inventing a religion. The famous show, The Good Place, where people do good things and they get good points, and they do bad things and they get bad points. And if you do enough good things, you go to the good place, and you do enough bad things, you go to the bad place. That is a much more, in my mind, human rational religion, right? That the basics of karma. And there are a variety of different karma-oriented religions in the world, that you get rewarded for doing good things and you get punished for doing bad things. But Christianity isn't that. It has this concept of grace and even more than that, atonement, that your debts can be paid by someone else. And the biblical story of how atonement works is a complicated one, and it's not an easy one for Christians to communicate in the modern world.
Well, maybe I can just ask you a follow-up question there. Is it fair for debts to be paid by someone else? Doesn't that sort of undermine a kind of fairness or structure, this sense that, well, maybe that's what you're exactly arguing, that it's not like the karma-centered view that you get what you deserve or you get one reward for one good deed. It's not rational or reasonable in that kind of narrow sense. But can you say a little bit more about the debt part of it and how
Sure.
Jesus comes to absolve those debts and whether you think that's fair?
Yeah, so I think that's right on. I think you're getting right to the heart of the issue of there is something, according to human mind and human reason, Christianity is deeply unfair in that your debts can be paid by another. And that at the heart of the Christian faith is something profoundly unfair, which is that Jesus is punished for something he did not do, that he takes on the debts or the sins of another. And that the people who are in heaven actually don't deserve to be there. That God has forgiven them and has not given them what they deserve. C.S. Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity, where I think he talks about someone who's drowning in a river. And, if you're drowning in a river and someone is on the shore and offers you a hand out, you would not shout back at them, "That's not fair. You're standing on solid ground." You would just happily take the hand and be pulled up and out of it. So the complaint, it's not fair. I think something for Christians, we're just very grateful that we're forgiven. And the belief that it's rational that God would die for us, it in an important sense is not. And that is the allure of Christianity, in many ways, the surprising beauty of it. So yeah, I think that's a great insight, and it's why I've always enjoyed chatting with you, Shadi, because I feel like Muslims understand the scandal of the gospel, that the claim that God dies for sinful people is a very disturbing thing for Muslims, and it's not for, I think, modern progressive secular people, because they think, of course, all people are good and lovable, and wouldn't God want to help us? So I've always enjoyed talking with Muslims about this, because I think you understand how crazy the gospel is.
Yeah, and I think one word that you always come back to, Matt, when you're talking about Christianity is its strangeness. And I think C.S. Lewis talks about it in a similar way. And I think one thing that I've had to come to terms with as I study Christianity more is this idea that strangeness is precisely the point. Christianity is supposed to be strange. So here I come as an outsider, as a Muslim, and I'm trying to force a kind of internal logic on Christianity. I'm trying to make it make sense for me. And that's not actually what I should be doing. I have to sort of sit in the strangeness. But that leads me to another question, that it's interesting that Christianity is quite strange, but it's also quite appealing. I mean, the fact that it's the largest religion in the world, it has around 2.5 billion followers. It has been the most successful religion in terms of sheer numbers, although Islam is coming up strong in the number 2 spot. But for now, Christianity is still tops in that regard. So I think it is telling that something could be so strange, but also so appealing. It's not as if this is some strange religion that people don't actually want to follow. A lot of people do want to follow it and have wanted to follow it historically. So there's almost a kind of paradox there.
Yeah, so Christianity, in one sense, is quite strange and wild and crazy and difficult to believe. But in another sense, the Christian story of a profound and unlikely hero sacrificing himself for the good of others, we can hear it resonate in Hollywood, in novels, in different fairy tales throughout history, in a wide variety of cultures, stories of redemption, stories of atonement. I think we can hear them echoed throughout history in different tribes and cultures around the world. And there is something about the Christian message that resonates with the human experience. This sense of guilt, right? That something is not right, that the world is not how it should be, that we shouldn't be killing each other. We shouldn't be lying to each other. We shouldn't be abusing one another, that something's deeply wrong. And that every human attempt to fix it seems to fail. Every form of technology, every kind of education, every political leader seems to let us down. And we seem to have this longing for another world deep within our hearts, and no amount of money or sex or power can fill that hole or that need for healing. And what Christianity does, and what Lewis is talking about, is it speaks to that deep human longing for healing, for restoration. It explains our pain, our suffering, our heartbreak. And it says something which, of course, I believe is deeply true, that it's not supposed to be this way, and that we were made for something better. And we all feel isolated, and we long for a deeper connection with each other and with God. And so I think that the compelling nature of the story is just that it tells something, deeply true about the human condition.
So now what I want to do is I want to challenge a couple of C.S. Lewis's assumptions and kind of lay out for listeners where he loses me. and maybe where Christianity loses me more broadly. And then I'll just see what you have to say to that, Matt. So he starts off the book, I think, in a very compelling way, saying that we all have a natural intuition of what is wrong or right. We know that if we cheat or lie, that we're not supposed to be doing that. And so C.S. Lewis argues basically that this is proof that religion and God are true. And that's something that can be shared by Islam, Christianity, and Judaism and other faiths. That the fact that we have that natural intuition, we have a sense of the moral law, which is a kind of law of decency, the golden rule, some people call it, that there's just some things that fundamentally seem wrong or right, and we don't know where that comes from. And because we don't know where that sense of fundamental rightness comes from, it must be proof of some kind of divine order. Now, where I have trouble, like that assumption makes sense to me. But then he kind of goes in a more original sin direction after that, saying that we have that natural moral intuition, but then most of us are actually pretty bad. None of us obey the moral law completely, not even the best of us. And most of us violate it daily. And we do it knowing that we're going against what's right. So this leads C.S. Lewis to argue that there's a kind of invasion of darkness. There's a kind of essential human depravity that divides us from our aspirations, that we want to do what's right at some level, but there's a darkness that takes over. And he doesn't really use the phrase original sin, I don't believe, maybe once or twice, but I could be wrong about that. But obviously in Catholicism, the phrase original sin is much more paramount. But I think there is a sense of innate human depravity that colors different denominations of Christianity. And that's where I start to feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's assuming a darkness that I don't think is always justified. And it depends on how you look at the world and how you look at human history. I could look at human history and say, well, actually, there is so much beauty, there is so much goodness, there are so many examples of human beings doing what is right and good. And I do think that we see a kind of progress in human history as well. I have to be careful here about progress. But things have gotten better over time. Slavery was abolished. The fact that we now have human rights principles that, well, I guess actually I shouldn't bring that up now that the Iran war is happening in Gaza and all of that. But there has been, I think, a shift towards trying to adopt universal human rights principles. There have been things that we can be proud of. I mean, the fact that the kind of extreme poverty and injustice that we saw in the medieval ages is no longer quite what it was before. Human progress is a real thing. But can you say a little bit more? Because I think this assumption is really important, because to be a Christian, as I understand it, means that you have to believe in some kind of fundamental human depravity as your starting assumption, or some kind of conception of original sin.
Well, Shadi, I'm surprised at you, man. I mean, I think that of all the Christian doctrines, human depravity is the easiest one to prove. Take any issue of the New York Times from now since the Civil War and look at the front page and you'll see murders, you'll see war, you'll see greed, you'll see racism, you'll see all kinds of things, human beings doing just awful, terrible things. But seriously, though, I do think we should be careful about what C.S. Lewis is saying and what he's not saying. He's not saying that human beings are monsters. He's not saying that human beings are beasts or totally depraved in the sense that they are just every human being is a Hitler. That's not what he's saying. What he's trying to say is that there is something within the human person that makes us do things we don't want to do. And this is going back to why is Christianity compelling? It's because we all know this, that like we set out with certain intentions for our day and certain intentions for our year and certain hopes for our relationships. And we always seem to mess it up. We always seem to do things that we don't want to do. And that question of why is it that we can't be as faithful as we want to be? Why is it that we can't be as generous? Why do we sabotage ourselves? And so depravity, sin is not, this belief is not that Christians think human beings are horrible. It's that there is something broken with us, in us, and there's no part within us that seems to be able to fix it. So if I read enough books, will I stop doing this? No. If I exercise every day, will I stop doing this? No. If I meditate every day, will I stop being sinful? No. Like, there is no human technology to fix this kind of issue. And that's what Christianity is talking about. It's not saying human beings are monsters or they can't, progress in terms of technology and all of these kinds of things. But it is to say that we don't seem to be able to solve this. So for Christians, we look at AI, for example, and we think, oh, there are lots of great things that AI can do. But we have no expectation that AI will be able to heal the human heart and our deep longing for connection with each other and with God. It will only amplify our goodness and our evil. And so this is where, Islam and Christianity diverge in terms of our understanding of human beings' sinfulness, I think.
And before I'll just say what the Islamic position is, I will say that I'm somewhat sympathetic to the idea of brokenness. I like that term. So while I don't subscribe to original sin or fundamental, human depravity, I do think there is something about being broken that is very powerful. And in some sense, we all feel broken in one way or another. And that's why I'm not particularly bothered when people say that religion is a crutch. Because if your leg is broken, you need something that helps you stand. And I think that's what religion can do. It acknowledges our reality and it says, hey, your leg is not going to be completely healed. You're going to need something that helps you get through and walk along the way.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to maybe, I'm uncomfortable that we're agreeing right now, so I'm gonna mess it up.
Oh, please.
So I think for Christians, it's not just the sense that we're broken, but also that we are. Augustine would say we're turned in on ourselves. We're selfish. We've turned away from God and towards ourselves and towards the world. And so it's not just that we have a limp, it's that we become self-serving and we don't look to serve others or we don't look to serve God. We think about ourselves first. And so we actually need God to help us turn ourselves towards others, to love others. And we need God to help us love him as well, that we're not even capable of that we actually need God's help to do those things.
So the Islamic position is that we as human beings have something called fitra. Fitra means, it's translated in different ways, sometimes as human nature, sometimes as the innate disposition. But according to the Islamic tradition, our innate disposition is one that is inclined towards God, that is in accordance with God's will, but that nature is then corrupted by society. And this is actually one of the reasons that sometimes Muslims who convert will say that they're reverts, because they're not converting to something new, they're reverting to their innate disposition, which is one of submission, one of Islam in a broader sense of submission.
Yeah, no, like in that sense, I think we could come a little closer. I mean, in the sense that humanity's first orientation is towards God, and then we break from that we are made for union with God, and we long for God. But a rupture has happened. So Jesus restores us to our original design.
Yeah, and that's why I think this assumption that C.S. Lewis starts with is so important, because he builds the case for Christianity on this assumption of sin, darkness, and depravity. and that Jesus is the only thing that can resolve that essential problem. So this is actually very crucial, as I understand it, to the Christian argument, that you need one for the other, and they work in tandem, and that the salvation that Christ offers, his dying for the sins of humanity, only makes sense if you acknowledge that there is something called original sin. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that was easy. Okay. So I think this actually presents a kind of problem in C.S. Lewis's paradigm, because if Christianity can only make sense in response to a particular problem, then you have to agree that that particular problem is the way that it is. But I think that's fine. All religions, I think, posit different starting points and different assumptions. One other assumption that I think he makes, and I didn't fully understand this, is that he says that Jesus Christ can only be Lord or a crazy man. There is no in between. He can't be a great moral teacher. He can't be a prophet. There is no middle ground. And it's interesting, C.S. Lewis was aware of Islam, and we take the middle position, of course, as Muslims, that Jesus Christ is not Lord or Savior, and he is not a crazy man. He is one of the greatest prophets in the history of humanity, but a prophet nonetheless. Therefore, he is a mortal. He is a man with divine inspiration, but not divine himself. Can you walk us through that kind of assumption? Maybe, I don't know if you feel as strongly about it as C.S. Lewis does, but he seems to think that it's all or nothing, and that kind of rankled me a little bit.
Sure. Well, I mean, if we just take the sort of things that Jesus says about himself in the Bible, he says, I'm the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the doorway to God. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. He says all of these things about himself. And C.S. Lewis, sort of says, if you were to meet someone on the street who said these kinds of things to you, what would you think about such a man, right? You would think such a man was crazy to make those kinds of claims. But more than that, if you understand Jewish piety and how important humility is before God, to compare yourself to God in the Jewish world is a great sin. He claims to be able to forgive sins. He claims to have authority over the Sabbath. He claims to be able to judge the world. He says, before Abraham was, I am. So he says, I and the Father are one. So these are all just massive claims. And so that's the first thing. But I'm anticipating the Muslim response, which is, well, Jesus didn't actually make these claims about himself. Right,
exactly. You read my mind.
Yeah, so Jesus didn't actually make these claims about himself. These are just things that the disciples said about him in order to build up their movement. That, hey, we follow Jesus, and he's a really big deal. Here's our evidence for him being a really big deal. So, but the problem with that theory, that basically Jesus, that the disciples, after Jesus was gone, the disciples built him up in this huge way. The problem with that is, if they why would they manufacture this enthusiasm about Jesus if it meant that they would be banished by all of their Jewish brothers and sisters, and they would be hunted by the Roman emperor? So basically, the disciples did not get rich from their claim that Jesus was God. In fact, they did not get powerful. They did not get popular. In fact, they all got hunted and were killed. And so these kinds of claims just don't really make sense. Why you would do that to yourself? Why would Jewish people start claiming that a person is God. If you understand Jewish history and culture, that is just not something that Jewish people would do. I guess in terms of the kind of respect that Jewish people have for the otherness of God, it is something to imagine a small Muslim community claiming that one of their leaders was Allah, right? That is just unimaginable. And so that's my pushback.
That's interesting. That's actually a really good response. I mean, I don't doubt that the disciples believed what they said. I think it's possible that people get things wrong and they interpret things wrongly. I think it's also worth noting. I mean, a lot of the core convictions of Christianity or Christian doctrine were not established until several centuries later. So there were disagreements early on about the nature of the Trinity, the nature of Jesus' divinity, that only were resolved later. They weren't necessarily resolved right away. And I think it's also worth noting the centrality of Paul in kind of developing early Christianity. And that's why sometimes Paul is thought of as a kind of founder of Christianity in that sense of kind of articulating the key doctrines. But it's possible, I think the Muslim response would be that it's possible that Paul got certain things wrong and misinterpreted certain things about Jesus' message. But we don't have to get into all that, but I think that's just what the Muslim response would be.
Sure. And I mean, I think I would just say that, yes, the creeds and confessions were established later, but stunningly early we have evidence in the first and second century of the core doctrines of the Christian faith being established within Christian communities around the Roman Empire. And yeah, it's not dictated by imperial fiat until a couple hundred years later, but yeah, this isn't the quotes I gave you. Those aren't from Paul. Those are from Jesus, or the disciples writing about Jesus. Paul did not write the Gospels.
Right.
Those are from his disciples. So I think to claim that Jesus, that is a popular thing, to claim that Paul is the true founder of the Christian faith, I think really misses how influential the apostles were in spreading the Christian faith.
Yeah, fair point. So now I want to move on to a little bit of a different topic that comes up a number of times in C.S. Lewis's book, and that's in regards to the nature of doubt. Because he was a convert, but you think that a convert would be quite zealous and quite committed and not have doubts about the core convictions of the faith in which he had just joined. But it's interesting to me that on page 140, for our listeners and viewers who want to follow along if they have their copies at home, I'm sure some of you do, he says, quote, "Now that I am a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbable," end quote. So it's remarkable to me that, like, this is something we wouldn't necessarily see from a Muslim theologian or a Muslim lay theologian saying, hey, I converted to Islam 10 or 15 years ago. I'm writing this book, but I still have like my moods or moments in which I doubt the whole thing. I think that's a very striking admission from C.S. Lewis. And this has actually come up. So Matt and I co-direct a fellowship called the Templeton Pluralism Fellowship, where we have 6 Muslim fellows and 6 Christian fellows, and they gather over the course of 2 years to discuss and debate different questions relating to faith and politics. And this has come up several times now between the fellows, where the Christians seem a little bit uncomfortable that the Muslims aren't
frustrated. Yeah.
And disappointed even that the Muslims don't necessarily express doubt about some of their core convictions. It doesn't even seem plausible to them that Islam might not be true. They have seemingly such certainty and conviction that it wouldn't occur to them to doubt.
Yeah, so why is that? I mean, I know Christianity is on trial today, but what's up with Muslims not at least admitting doubt.
I think we would argue that if a religion is true and if it's in accordance with our human reason and human intuition and human nature, that there shouldn't be too much doubt about the core creedal commitments. Now, we can doubt secondary matters, and there is a rich diversity of interpretation on anything that is secondary. So that could be interpretations of Islamic law and how to implement Islamic law, or whether or not even certain aspects of Islamic law should be implemented in the modern era. Muslims disagree profoundly on those questions, and that's one of the reasons we have conflict in Muslim majority states, because Muslims are constantly disagreeing with each other. But when it comes to the core creedal commitments, so for example, whether or not the Quran is fully divine. So basically, the Islamic teaching that all of us have is that every single letter and word of the Quran is directly from God. There is no human mediation. Prophet Muhammad played no role in the actual content of the text. That is completely from God. And I think because of that, that leaves less room for doubt when it comes to whether or not you believe the Quran is from God, because that is the creedal requirement. Where I think in Christianity it's somewhat different. There's a lot of room for doubt because it was the disciples who kind of, going back to what we said previously, we don't know, it's not as if Jesus himself said X, Y, or Z. The disciples recounted what they believed Jesus said to them, or what they remembered that Jesus said to them. So the New Testament, as I understand it, it's not considered God's actual speech, even though it might have elements of God's actual speech. It's still written by men. And that's why Christians can disagree on the contents of the New Testament and whether all of it is worth believing in at the same level as... Yeah, again, I don't want to misspeak here, but I think the Quran is just fundamentally different in that respect.
So, Shadi, are you saying you don't doubt the core features of the Islamic faith ever?
I don't doubt that the Quran is directly from God.
You've never experienced doubt about that?
Look, I think that I've experienced moments of doubt about... I mean, I sometimes I'll say, like, half jokingly that I'm like 99% sure that Islam is true. Look, is there a small chance that Islam is not true? Sure, but I would say that's the case for anything, really.
Okay.
There is a chance that when we die, God will come and tell us, like, hey, you know, maybe you got X, Y, or Z wrong on some of your creedal commitments. I just think it's very unlikely, and I don't doubt it in any active sense. It's not something that I'm weighed by. It's not something that I struggle with.
Okay.
And I think that's oftentimes an unsatisfying answer to non-Muslims. They'll say, they want to push me to feel more doubt. Like, why wouldn't you? But I would maybe think of this a little bit differently. Do you have doubts about whether Jesus Christ died for your sins? Do you have doubts that he is the Savior? Because I think the equivalent to the Quran in Christianity is not the New Testament. It's Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, as I understand it. That's why I think Muslims often get things wrong when they try to compare Scripture and say, well, the Quran is better or more superior because it's not written by men, but the New Testament is written by men.
Yeah.
But that's not actually the right comparison to make.
Yeah, no, to answer your question, no, I don't have doubts. I think more my experience of doubt has to do often with my own human condition of going through a really difficult time in my life, or like a personal struggle or something like that, where things get dark and I'm not thinking straight, or I'm wrestling with depression or something like that, and I have to kind of go through it, or I have doubts about what God is doing. Where I thought God was saying this, or God was leading me in one direction, but then it seems to become clear that he's not leading me in that way, this way or that way. But as far as the core of, does God love me and is God with me? Those are not things that I doubt.
I think that we as Muslims have doubts that we don't always talk a whole lot about. when it comes to understanding God's will in the world. To quote the Nick Cave song, do we believe in an interventionist God? And I think that, which is a great song, it's called Into My Arms. It's a beautiful kind of spiritual meditation as a rock song. But anyway, I think that I sometimes, like, why is this happening in my life? What does God want from me? Is it God's will for me to do X, Y, or Z? Am I feeling God's presence, or does he feel like he's kind of left me in some way? I think there's things like that, the so-called dark night of the soul that all of us go through, and we know that even some of the great Islamic sages went through their own dark nights. I think it's a common experience.
Maybe a good way to, explain this, why Christians talk about doubt.
That would be helpful.
Or even lament towards God is, I've got 3 boys, and if I'm in a good spot with them and we're getting along really well, they feel comfortable coming to me and talking to me about struggles that they're having, or frustrations that they're having, or even things that they don't like about how I'm being their dad, right? But if I'm being really distant from them, or if they don't feel safe with me, they just won't tell me what's going on. They'll keep it to themselves. And I think what I would say is, this is the kind of healthy doubt or lament or frustration that Christians can have, is when you feel truly comfortable with God, when you feel safe with God, you will talk to God about things that frustrate you, things that confuse you, things that you're struggling to accept. And so I think for many Christians, they see doubt as the marker of a mature faith. That when you feel comfortable talking to God about your doubts or your frustrations or whatever, that's the mark of true maturity. And if you can't talk to God about your doubts, maybe that means that your faith is weak or brittle, that you can't admit that you have doubts or something like that. Because we are safe with God, we can tell him things that we're frustrated or confused about. Whereas if we had a father that we thought would be offended or would just get mad at us, then we wouldn't bring our doubts to him.
Yeah. But maybe we don't see it so much as a father-son relationship in that regard.
So the analogy breaks down, right? I think the same, but I'm just trying to...
Totally.
Yeah.
I would say that I think that we're encouraged from an early age in sort of Muslim contexts to not entertain our doubts too much, because I think there's a fear that once you open a particular door, then there's a kind of chaos, a kind of intellectual or spiritual chaos that results. And it's not particularly beneficial to open that door because you don't know where it will lead. Like, I think we know this intuitively in our everyday lives. Like, once you start wondering about something, you start to get in these mental loops, and then you start asking additional questions, and then you can kind of spiral into doubt. And I think there's just a sense of wanting to protect Muslims from that. But I think that if you talk to Muslims privately, they'll admit to you, hey, Shadi, I don't know why God is doing this. I don't know what his plan is. Why is this his plan for me? And I think that when learning from some of my Sufi teachers in a kind of more mystical context, I would say, I think that these people have encouraged me to come to God in my prayers and to say, hey, God, I'm frustrated. But I think that's not super mainstream in the current Islamic context. But I think more people understand that being frustrated is okay. Because how could we not be? Life is difficult. Life involves suffering. And sometimes we don't know what God's plan is for us, and we don't know why God is operating in a certain way. We don't know what his wisdom is. His wisdom is not always apparent to us. So I think sometimes now I'm becoming more comfortable kneeling down in prayer and saying, hey, God, I'm this isn't really working for me right now. I'm really struggling. I don't feel your presence. I want to feel it. What's going on? Help me out. And I think that what doubt can do, it opens up the possibility of having that more personal back and forth with God, where it's just like, hey, I need you right now. Help me. So I think that there is more than enough room for that in Islam, but we don't always know how to talk about it in the right way. And I think that's something that we as Muslims can learn from our Christian brothers and sisters, to be more comfortable expressing doubt and not always having to have this facade of certainty. I think that we as Muslims, because we have this sense that we're we're the most quote unquote rational religion, that it's 2 + 2 = 4. Everything in Islam has this kind of internal logic. We almost feel like to admit doubt would be to introduce doubt into the whole Islamic project, the whole Islamic enterprise. And because we're so self-conscious about our religion being rational, we feel like, oh, of course we shouldn't doubt, because it's so rational, it's so logical. Of course 2 + 2 = 4. Should we doubt that 2 + 2 = 4? So I think that we have to challenge ourselves more in that, and I'm glad that you and our Christian fellows in the program have pushed us on this.
Well, I mean, can I ask you a personal question? So after you kneel down and you pray to God and you say, God, this is not working. I'm frustrated. I don't see which way is up. How do you feel after you talk to God in that way?
It feels better in the sense that I've kind of let off some steam. I've gotten something off my chest. And it also means that I can have a more personal relationship with God. And I think one thing that I've struggled with is seeing God as this kind of austere, strict. He's somewhat removed from us. He's inaccessible. He's far away. And I think that we do ourselves an injustice if we view God in that way. And I've had to kind of work against that. That's how I've felt about God for a long time. And now I'm trying to feel closer to him. So if I can kind of kneel down and say, I'm frustrated, God, it means that I can have a closer relationship that's more of a back and forth, instead of just being this kind of one-way thing where I just ask God things and then it's just like, oh, he's far away, he's removed. I just have to believe that things will work out. So I think it's good. I think it's a good practice, and I think I benefited from it, but I'm still working on that.
So for our Christian listeners, what is your sense of the Sufi versus the Sunni answer to this kind of way of talking to God?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, the vast majority of Sufis are within the Sunni tradition. It's just unfortunate that Sufism has gotten a bad rap, especially over the last 150 years. There's a long story as to why that is. I think one aspect of it is that Muslims in the early 20th century were very much on the back foot because of colonialism, imperialism, and missionary work that was happening in the Middle East, where Christian missionaries were coming in and trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. So a lot of Muslim apologists during that time really doubled down on this idea that Islam is a simple, easy, logical, rational faith, because we wanted to have a strong argument against the Christian missionaries. So what we did, we de-emphasized the mystical Sufi strains of Islam, because we were worried those mystical strains would make Islam seem otherworldly. It would make Islam seem more irrational or unreasonable or strange. And we wanted to kind of dilute the strangeness away and be more of a rational faith. So I think now what we're seeing is more and more Muslims, especially in the West, are trying to recover those Sufi mystical strains that were lost during modernity, when Islam was being codified and rationalized.
Yeah, I mean, but for a Sunni has no interest or background in the Sufi tradition, would they be uncomfortable with complaining to God? And why would they be uncomfortable with that?
I think they'd be uncomfortable because,
Like, does it feel disrespectful?
yeah, disrespectful that if God is the all-knowing, we shouldn't be frustrated with God's will playing out because we as mere mortals don't have access to what that is. And we have to have this kind of this total faith in his wisdom and that certainty that whatever God wills for us will be made apparent in due time, and that he has a plan that is beyond our kind of understanding. And so to be frustrated with how our lives are going, or to be frustrated that God hasn't given us something, or God hasn't answered one of our prayers or some of our prayers, it means that we're not grateful. And we should be wholly grateful towards God. I think that's some version of that would be the retort.
Okay.
Which is understandable. I think there's...
Well, it's very logical, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it could cultivate a sort of passive or even stoic sort of posture towards life, that you just have to take what God gives you and be okay with it.
And look, I think that passive stoic approach can be helpful in some circumstances. I think one thing that we as Muslims marvel at is, I think, to use a word that I think is a little bit archaic, but the steadfastness of the Gazan people, or the steadfastness of Muslim populations that are suffering in civil war in the Congo or Sudan or so forth. The fact that there hasn't been any kind of evidence of Gazans losing their faith. Because you'd think that if you were being, if I could imagine Gazans having a kind of encounter with God in their prayers and being like, God, how did you allow this to happen? How are we supposed to make sense of this? What is God's plan for us? What is going on here? But actually what we've seen is a very strong religious commitment that seems to be quite widespread in Gazan society. So I think there's this sense that instead of questioning why God is allowing the Israeli military to kill their family members and bombard their homes, to have this kind of unquestioning, unwavering faith that this all makes sense in the greater scheme of things.
Well, I just think, one thing that'll be interesting to see in the next 100 years is, how Islam responds to post-modernity and late secularism. Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age, talks about, in pluralistic societies, to live in a secular society is to be constantly encountering people with different stories and different faiths than your own, and to recognize that, gosh, if I had been born into a different family, my faith would have been completely different. So for Charles Taylor, contingency, this understanding that there are in the world people living very different paths than you, and that your life could have been different given one twist or another. It'll be interesting to see how that sort of Islamic posture of, absolute certainty, how it navigates that sort of extreme contingency in life.
I think that absolute certainty is challenged in the West, especially here in America, which is in some ways the kind of almost an ideal example. And I don't mean ideal, it's not quite ideal, obviously, but it's as pluralistic as you can possibly get for a large country to be as diverse and unwieldy and chaotic as ours is. And that is a challenge for Islam. And there's actually this poll that I've seen people discussing recently. Someone wrote something about Muslim assimilation in the U.S. recently, and it's been getting some attention on Twitter. And we can include a link to that in the show notes for those who are interested. But the fact that 1/4 of those who are raised Muslim in America leave Islam, the number is 23% to be exact, according to this one survey. That's actually a pretty big percentage. It's not nearly as much as those who leave Christianity or Catholicism, or mainline Protestantism, which hemorrhage members at greater rates. But still, the idea that you would have 25% of Egyptians or Jordanian Muslims leaving Islam, that's unheard of, because Muslims in those countries are not confronted with alternatives. They're not confronted with atheism as a live option. I mean, most Muslims in these countries won't really be exposed to atheism, or they won't be exposed to this idea that you can leave the idea of leaving one's religion in a place like Egypt is not really something that is discussed publicly. You just don't do it, and no one questions that, right? But now that we live in a place like America where you can leave your religion, some people do. And that means that there is this sense that if we can try to raise Muslim kids in Muslim families, but we have no guarantee that they're going to stay Muslim. And that's a very new thing. That's a very hard thing, I think, for my parents' generation to really contend with, that there was a cost to coming to America, that things are more fluid, and our own conception of our religious identity is more fluid when we're living in this kind of pluralistic chaos.
Yeah, and in that, Christians and Muslims in America come together in sort of that common experience of plurality and contingency. But Shadi, I know you had a couple other things to talk about with C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity, but thanks for going down the doubt road.
Yeah, that was a nice little rabbit hole. That's actually most of what I wanted to bring up. Those were the key points that really kind of animated me in reading C.S. Lewis's book. There's obviously so much more we could talk about, including on questions around how he talks about the Trinity, but perhaps those are best left for another time. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and really enjoyed talking to you about this very important book. Any final thoughts that you want to leave us with, Matt?
Well, I do know that we had this discussion with the fellows of, is there an Islamic equivalent of this book? For our Christian listeners who might want to dive into Islam, do you have any recommendations for us?
Yeah, this actually came up when we were discussing it with our fellows, and a couple of them suggested the work of Martin Lings, who himself was a convert, who I believe knew C.S. Lewis, if I recall correctly. So there's a couple of works from Martin Lings, which we can share in the show notes, that might be of interest, and I'll also look back and see what might be best from him to share with our listeners and viewers. But I think that my feeling is that what C.S. Lewis has done here is actually quite unique. And I think also as a lay theologian, the fact that someone who's relatively ordinary and doesn't actually claim to be an expert could actually come up with something so compelling. I think that there is sometimes in Islamic context a kind of deference to those who have theological credentials, and to have a lay person kind of lay things out is sometimes looked at with suspicion. I think that another book, a book I would recommend on the history of Islam, it's a little bit more historical. It's not quite like what C.S. Lewis has done, but it has that kind of lay popular appeal, which is Reza Aslan's No God But God, which is an excellent book to get a basic handle on Islam's evolution, its founding doctrines, and I think also why Islam is compelling to so many people. Reza Aslan's book, No God But God, would be very high on my list as well.
Well, Shadi, thank you. As a Christian, I'm grateful for your willingness to read one of our books and engage it so deeply. And
maybe we'll do the reverse sometimes. If we can find the right book that is the kind of not perfect equivalent, but maybe something close, that would be really interesting for me to turn the tables on you.
Absolutely. Well, I would get to poke and push you there. So.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Thanks for listening to Zealots at the Gate. If you like what you heard, check out other episodes at comment.org. Zealots at the Gate is hosted by Comment Magazine, produced by Rachel Collins. Technical production is by Ali Crummy. Audience strategy by Matt Crummy. And editorial direction by Ann Snyder.